Thank you for joining I Am Possible, which is India's first future tech meets sustainability podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Anu Acharya, who's the CEO of Mapmygenome, which is focused on preventive healthcare through healthy habits by combining genetic health profile and health history with genetic counseling. So Anu, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. Before we get into the company, why don't we start with a brief introduction?
Thank you, Eddie, and I'm privileged to be on your show. Just to give a brief background, I think to help people understand where I came from, I think one is that I did undergrad and masters from IIT Kharagpur, was in the US. Did a couple more masters, worked for a startup and a consulting firm, and then in the year 2000 started a company called Ocimum Biosolutions. Along with two other co-founders, Subhash and Dr. Sujata. That was a company that we created to be able to work on the research side. So we were doing mostly B2B, work with large pharmaceutical companies and large biotech companies. And we became one of the largest genomic services players worldwide. We had labs in the US, in Netherlands, in Germany, and in India. So I think that was the starting point, or where we started getting interested in what where health was moving towards, and I think that's where the ideas of why to start something in the Mapmygenome, or the direct-to-consumer space came up. But I'll leave that for some more time. But I think in 2013 is when we started Mapmygenome. And we started with a simple concept of being able to get consumers to be curious and excited about what the DNA can tell them about themselves. And I think over the last 8 years, we've grown to be a company that not only does that, but we've been able to do a lot of work on the clinical genomic side, on the oncology and mother and child. And we've also been doing a lot of COVID testing, as a lot of the molecular biology companies in this country have done.
Why don't we start by explaining what is DNA and its role in human biology?
So I think when you want to understand what DNA is, it's basically like the software of your life, right? So like we have an instruction manual on how to make something. Your DNA is sort of like that. You're sort of creating that instruction. You're taking that instruction manual from any part of your body. It could come from your blood, your saliva, or any tissue that you're looking at, which will give you. So your DNA is what is there in your cells, which we have trillions of. So you basically have to get any cell, get the DNA from those. So typically we would use saliva, or we would use blood samples. Sometimes we have used hair samples as well. So any of these samples is where you would collect the DNA from. And this is sort of, like I mentioned earlier, it is your blueprint of your life. And this is written, instead of writing from A to Z, we basically write it in 4 letters. We don't write it. It's written in A, C, T, and G. And we help to understand what is there in those A, C, T, and G. Because that sort of helps you understand from DNA, then it becomes RNA, and then it becomes protein, and it sort of different tissues will express differently, and it makes us who we are. I think the interesting part about DNA is that we are 99.9% alike, all humans. But yet, I think if you actually look at the instruction manual for each individual, you'll find that each person is somewhat different and slight and unique. And I think so in many ways, your DNA is more unique than any other forms of identification that you may think of, because it is different for every single person.
Biology, it's so unique. It's so fantastic. You mentioned DNA. We've got 4 different chemical, A, C, T, G, and these repeating patterns makes us who we are. It's a blueprint of a life. And the most unique part is that you mentioned that 99.9% of all our DNA is completely similar. It's just that 1% which makes up the entire human race. And we are pretty much close to all animals and even the trees, right? So maybe could you elaborate on the magic of this life and DNA? How what has got done? Is it just repeating patterns, ACTG, ACTG, ACTG all over? Would you like to bring your views?
Sure. So I think, when we break it down and we see that this is all made up of ACTGs, but then they add up to something else, right? So you have your ACTG that sort of codes for a gene, and then ultimately that expresses in a form of a protein and so on. Now, I know the simpler way to understand this is that, like I mentioned, if this was an instruction manual, you had different paragraphs that were explaining what was there. So you can consider that as being a gene. What happens now is that these genes are then expressed into something. So you'll find that even though your DNA is the same in all your body, you'll find that your liver is doing something else, your kidney is doing something else, your different organs are doing something else that is different for each part of the body. So it is fascinating because there are some things that is telling different cells to do different things, right? So you have the same instruction manual, but it's how it expresses itself that makes it do different things for different organs and different parts of who we are. So when you actually break it down and you mention trees and animals and all of that, we are quite similar to chimpanzees, and we are also 50% close, apparently the same as bananas, right? So I think it's interesting because you're basically breaking it down to a point where all of life can somewhat be explained, that how did all of this come about, right? So when you think about it from possibilities that might have started in the beginning, we started with like a single cell and then it became, multicellular organs and so on. So in some ways, the starting material was the same. It sort of became more and more complex as we got along, and it started becoming more developed. And as a result, I think we do find that everything that we see, every living organism will have something that is in common with all of us, right? And I think that's where it all starts off. And I think maybe a few hundred years later from now, we will be the chimpanzees of the next species that arises, right? Who knows? But it's the same thing. I think it's an evolution, and that evolution is bringing us to becoming different, adapting to the environment differently, and as a result, I think newer species come up.
Right. Yeah, yeah. So we just kind of understanding the blueprint of life. 2003, the human DNA project. I mean, we kind of sequenced the entire human genome, and then 2021, the 8% which was remaining, we have kind of managed to do that also. What has been the learnings of understanding the human genome so far?
So I think when in 2001, and that was around the time I started my first company. At that point, I think we didn't know much, right? So it needed a lot of scientists across the world to be able to figure all of this out. We didn't have the technology to look at large number of genes at one stage. We didn't have ways of doing it. We were doing it using machines that were still not able to do the large sequencing that we see today, which we take for granted. So at that point, I think we put all of these pieces of information together, and it cost billions of dollars. Then I think we made there was a reference genome that all of us had access to. One of the things that I think we realized is that over the years, what we see in the DNA, we have to be able to find that it has to be representative of the population that you're studying as well. And while the reference genome was created, I think as we started looking at the data that was there in the world, a lot of it was heavily Caucasian, and now over a period of time, I think things have started to change. But I think that was one big problem, that you can think you're going towards precision medicine, but if you don't have representation from every single population that we are studying, then we are not going to be able to get to that part. That is number one. The second is, I think that the whole world of DNA, I think people have also heard about newer technologies like CRISPR, Cas, and others. And those are great tools that are both good and bad. So that is another thing that is there. And the third, of course, is that while over a period of time we get to know more and more about different genes, different their functions, and so on. But I think that as a human race, we shouldn't get to a point where we start thinking that we know everything about everything. We don't. And I think that's where we, as scientists or as people who want to pursue further, I think there are still questions that we still have unanswered. But as we go along, as we keep continuing to do this, continuing to understand more about our DNA, I think what is exciting is that we know a little bit more than what we knew earlier. So in some ways, we are standing on the shoulders of giants that did the work for us before, and we are able to add a little bit more to that level of knowledge that we have in the universe.
Exciting things happening in the space of research and understanding things. And but you rightfully pointed out, I think there will always be something that we will need to discover no matter what point of history we are in, because I think the way this universe is created, I don't really know whether we'll ever know everything, because in the physics space also, there are people who are working on kind of understanding and trying to find a unified theory by understanding everything. And the same thing is happening the external world, and with the internal world we're trying to do with the human genome project. But yeah, I think nature does things in a way which is much more deeper. So it's a very exciting space. Now tell me, Mapmygenome, what is it and what is it that you guys do?
So maybe I'll explain the simplest or the first product we started with, because I think that sort of applies to anybody and everybody, and it's not a specialized problem that people have. So one of the things that we've realized is that a lot of people go to see a medical doctor when they have a problem, or the problem has become so bad that they can't manage it at home. And typically, many of these conditions are preventable. You're able to actually, if you knew ahead of time, you would be able to actually do something about it. So what we're doing at Mapmygenome and at the Genome Patri product, which is a wordplay on Janam Patri, is that we will ship out like a simple, this is like a little box that we have, right? So when people want to understand more, people place an order, you get a box like this that comes in the mail. Then we collect saliva sample, because that will give us a sample of their DNA. Of course, this can be done, like I mentioned earlier, you can do with blood sample or you can do it with a hair sample as well. So once you get that sample, we would then analyze that analyze that DNA sample, and then use our algorithms. We have a pattern on in that process where we are able to understand the risks that some individual might have to certain kinds of diseases, or we can start looking at it from a more traits sort of way, right? Why are you a certain way? Why is it that maybe some people have more a tendency to put on weight versus some people have curly hair versus, so it could be physical related traits, it could be behavioral traits, it could be something that is more a disease risk like hypertension and things like that. So we would look at it from those perspectives. And the third kind of things we're looking at are things like, are you a carrier of a certain condition, like a phenylketonuria or a G6PD? And the fourth thing that we also look at would be what kind of, like if you look at the common drugs, are you likely to respond well to that or not? Now, we do have specialized products in each of these spaces, but a genome patri is more like trying to put these pieces of information together. And once we get this report, which is very interesting 100-page plus report, we would then combine this with their family history, their health history, because in the end, I think like we have the nature versus nurture debate. I think you also understand that most diseases have a component that you can control, which is your own lifestyle and your eating. So your eating, your exercise, and all of that. So what we help people understand is that we put these pieces of information together, your lifestyle, your family history, your biochemistry reports, and all of that, and the genetic report, and then tell you what you can do. So you get a second report, which will sort of help you understand that if you have a risk for, let's say, type 2 diabetes, and let's say some sort of cardiovascular disease or some cancer or something like that, right? What we would help them understand is that what are the symptoms that typically are being seen, what they can do in terms of lifestyle changes. And the third is what are the kind of screening tests that are available. We tell them to go see a medical doctor with this report, because now it's a simplified way of them to understand what is it that you have a genetic risk for, other risks. So it will show you that you have a high risk for genetic risk, a low risk for your family history versus this thing, and then an overall risk that is given. So we help people understand that this is not a diagnostic. It doesn't mean you're going to get it, but it means that if you don't do all the right things, that you are likely to be at a higher risk category than someone who doesn't have that. And that's what we help people do. And we are now planning to add a few more steps downstream from that as well. So that's in a nutshell what we do. So we help people know themselves better, know why they are the way they are, and what they can do about it.
Right. So you're saying we're getting into a world through Mapmygenome, a world where instead of being reactive, you can be proactive. You can understand
Exactly.
and what you might have conditions that you have, and then you also counsel them on the right step or to take to kind of be healthy. Uh, would you like to address this precision medicine thing, because it's something, I mean, it's a small word, the word says everything, but it's very difficult to kind of understand for a lay person. So would you like to kind of understand precision medicine and the role of genomics over there?
So I think there are two, three things, right? One is that when you take a certain medicine or a drug, right, uh, we all assume that everybody reacts to it the same way as someone else. If someone else in the family has taken it, you'll assume that everybody will have that same response to it. What we are starting to understand is that there are certain genetic markers in your DNA that help us to understand if this might not work for you, right? Both in terms of the efficacy of the drugs, which means that some people you will find that a higher dose is better, some people lower dose is better, and it's because of the way that particular individual metabolizes that drug. Right? So some people might be able to do it well, others might not be able to do it as well. And I think this is when we talk about it from a DNA, it's basically that ultimately becomes a function that sort of makes your body not react as well as it should be. So that's helps the doctor to sort of personalize that whole, what kind of drugs are likely to work for them. So we have, for instance, a product called Medicamap, where we look at all the different kind of drugs available which have a genetic marker, and we help people understand that based on your genetic profile, what can you do to be able to, is that likely to work for you or not? So that, I think, is one dimension, that your genotype will help in identifying what sort of drugs are likely to work for you or not. But when you look at it from a precision medicine perspective, right, then you also have other data types that are likely to also influence this, right? So which means that I might have a drug, I have a genotype, but I might also be taking another drug. So that could be there's a drug-drug interaction. There is also the drug and the food interaction. So there are multiple things that are influencing your overall, response to something. And I think as we start to understand the value of each one of these factors, I think we get to a point where we can make medicine a lot more precise for that individual. So I think that's the way, that you can both personalize it, but make it a lot more precise. And I think from what we are doing at Mapmygenome is that we realize that there are some knowns and some unknowns, and all you have to keep on doing is use machine learning to sort of understand that as more and more variables are known in that. So if you can start to put in some of those pieces of the puzzle together, we can help in understanding how that response is likely to be.
Yeah, completely. So you spoke about machine learning, the genomics data, it's extremely complex and these repeating patterns over and over and again. What's the role of AI and machine learning over there?
So I think that genomics was the original big data before we called it the big data, right? Because I think when we look at any of our genomic information, each one of us has like 3.2 billion base pairs, right? So if you are doing, let's say, a whole genome sequencing, typically your amount of data you're looking at is like 90 GB or more than that, right? Depending on how much you're covering. So for each individual, you have so much information, so much data that is there, that it becomes hard, that unless you know what you're looking for, you would have to use some sort of a machine learning algorithm to sort of traverse that whole thing. So that is one part, right? So you have this large amounts of data. That's your genomic data. Then if you couple that with your medical records, you couple that with your lifestyle, you couple that with the history and many other pieces, you now have for each individual large amounts of data, large amounts of variables, large amounts of different different things that they do, like in terms of how they eat, how their activity and all of that. So in order to sort of put those pieces together, if you did not have machine learning, you would not be able to arrive at a point where you can very clearly say what needs to be done from there, because it's not easy to just look at that many pieces of data and be able to arrive at that answer. So I think that's one of the things that we are trying to do, is to be able to use machine learning to help in integrating some of these data points together.
What's the exciting innovations in the field of genomics that has caught your attention?
I think there are many. I think clearly, I think genomics, I think, becomes in many ways the basic form of what everything on medicine will ultimately be. It's not the only thing, but it is one of the most important pieces because it's the most quantifiable and easily studied area of what it can be. So when you look at it from perspective of genomics, I think one area that I find exciting is longevity. Like how do you look at aging as not being an expected outcome, that what can you do something about it that will sort of reduce our aging process, right? So these are things that we were taught earlier, that this is part of life and you are expected to age, and these things happen and in certain things. So I think one thing genomics has shown us is that there's a possibility of living longer, and not only living longer, but living healthier longer, right? So in some ways, it's a very different thing from saying I can keep someone alive till age of 100 versus saying I can keep someone fully alive and be normal and healthy and do everything that they can until they are until they die, right? I think that's the exciting thing about one thing that I find very fascinating about genomics. The second thing I think that is exciting is that earlier we used to lose a lot of babies, for instance, in because we didn't understand what was wrong with them. And in most cases, I think a simple diet change and other things actually can save a lot of these babies, or small interventions. And I think so when you look at it from a newborn screening perspective, I think that's an amazing place where you can actually reduce the mortality very significantly. And these can all be fairly easy for us to be able to implement. I think some countries already implement that. I think in India we now have a lot of programs that the government has brought in, and I think that will help in sort of addressing a lot of the challenges that we might have in the early stages of life. The other area that is exciting that I feel from a genomics perspective is also in helping us towards a precision medicine, which we talked about earlier, in saying that can we actually reduce the adverse effects of drugs. A lot of times, I think we would blame a doctor because someone died because of adverse effects. But I think if the doctors had the tools to be able to understand that, it's not like you can see somebody and decide that they will react well or not. I think, but if they had the tools, I think it helps doctors to sort of prescribe better. And then, of course, there are fascinating things like understanding your heritage, where you came from, and then the more exciting things about CRISPR-Cas and the possibilities that what your gene editing can potentially do in terms of either treating someone or otherwise coming up with new kinds of diagnostics and so on. So the list is endless. These are some of the things that came at the top of my mind.
Some really, really exciting things. You mentioned about the heritage. Why don't we talk a little bit more about your products, that you have the offer, and maybe you can possibly share the pricing plans also.
So heritage, what it does is basically it helps you in understanding, like all of us think that, we have our 7 generations of data, and we think that, like I'm from Bikaner and I know that, at least sitting with my brother and my mother to try to understand, our history. And most of our history over the last at least maybe 7-8 generations is well documented in Haridwar and other places. But when I did my own heritage report, for instance, I think you do find things that are, they have some amount of DNA that is similar to Central Asia, Pakistan, and a few other things. And some of it was more, some part of it came from parts of Europe and all of that. So I think it's exciting because it sort of helps you in understanding a little bit more about potentially where your ancestors must have come from, other than the immediate, seven. Maybe some people know 2-3 generations, and we knew about up to 7, but it's not enough, because I think in India also we've had a lot of different rulers that have come in, also Indians who have gone outside, some who seek knowledge and so on. So I think it's quite a fascinating space to be able to help in answering a fundamental question that all of us have, which is, who am I and where did I come from? So I think that is definitely one thing, and we help people understand that by using a product called Genome Heritage. Um, and of course, the first product that I mentioned was more Genome Patri. So most of these have now, we've brought down the pricing for all of these in a matter of a few years. I think today most of these products are priced between 6 and 7,000, 6 and 6.5. I think mostly in that price range. And we were able to bring it down because we said, one of the big challenges that people were having was that they said 15,000 or more was too expensive for the average person to sort of spend to understand about their own health or even curiosity in terms of where they come from. So I think that's one of the things that we have been able to do. And we are, like I mentioned before as well, that we are also trying to add in some biochemistry to this mix to make it more interesting and more precise.
Right, yeah, from $1 billion to 6,000. How cool is that? And possibly maybe in next 10 years, it could go down even more, and possibly it could be even free. And I think that's the world that we're going in, because I've been invested in the virtual reality space. And I guess, what I'm seeing, at least from my end, is that, right now these virtual reality headsets are around 40,000, 30,000. But eventually, I think the game plan of all of these players would be to kind of give it away free, because, what is most important is the data, because, data is where they will kind of be making money. So are you worried about that angle? Because this looks super exciting. Today I think the data of the COVID vaccine is easily available online, if you want to access it, and if it goes on to the fringe elements, and today I think even a student can kind of tinker around if he wants to go on the net, because the net is full of information. You can do so many things: CRISPR gene editing, CRISPR Cas9, and we kind of like discovering the like you mentioned, the blueprint of a human. Do you kind of like think about I'm sure that there are so many exciting things. We just spoken about diagnostics. There's also, I'm sure, therapeutics which people are working on. Maybe we'll get into that. But do you kind of get worried about a world where maybe it'll come to a point where people would kind of give away the entire genome data for free, and what kind of manipulation might arise from a situation like that?
So I think, as most of us, I'm sure we've seen like Gattaca and a few other movies, and I think we have a way of simplifying most of technologies, the new technologies that potentially are game changers, into either being good or bad, right? So a dystopian view or a utopian view. The truth is somewhere that it's in between, and I think ultimately, I think there are enough checks and balances to sort of help us steer to the right path. At least that's my own personal feeling. So, like any technology, whether it was fire in the, in the whatever age it was called, Iron Age, or discovery of fire could both be it's fantastic for we learned how to cook with it, but it could also be something that can be destructive. And I think it's the same with newer technologies like genomics and others, because you can use the same information that, let's say, a scientist has created, to either use it for the good or for the bad, right? And I think it will happen that, like you mentioned, some fringe elements might get access to it, and it's very possible. I think even today, I think when you look at it, there are lots of technologies that helped us, whether it was nuclear technology or otherwise, can be used for very good things, but can also be used for very bad things. So in the end, I think if the human race has to survive, and I think it should. Then I think what we will do is we will ultimately take a path that is the right path, because I think there will be people who will sort of help us guide through that whole what we are doing wrong. So when you look at, let's say, CRISPR-Cas, I think it's a genome editing. It's a way to do that. It is very simple compared to what was there in the past, but it is not yet that simple that anybody can do it to actually change it for generations, right? So I think, yes, there is a possibility of it happening, but at the same time, I think there is a possibility of it becoming very useful, both from a therapeutic or diagnostic or otherwise perspective, right? So you have to consider that if you're doing it for a person in their lifetime, I think it is a fine thing to do, right? Because if let's say somebody's has a disorder that, if a therapeutic can help them with that, I think it'll be great for them. But at the same time, I think if we are thinking that we can all make designer babies, and we can make in many different forms, you can do create monsters or whatever it is that people are thinking of. I think there are legal and regulatory boundaries that exist for that purpose, to be able to make sure that it doesn't happen. But if it does, I think there will be enough of there will be enough hue and cry to make sure that that won't happen. But at the same time, you can't say it will never happen, because, like most technologies, we've seen that happens. But eventually, I think the world does go on, and I think some of these technologies have been helpful for us even during the pandemic. So technology by itself, I think, is good. Scientists discovering something new is what drives our world forward.
Completely.
It's curiosity. But how we use it is up to us, as humans.
Completely, yes. I mean, because we living in a super fantastic time, and there's not one single technology. I think almost everything is converging, and when it's converging, it's creating things which is, I think, completely going to transform the way we live. And it's going to touch all parts of life. So I'm super excited of the space. Yes, there are, like, people who have kind of tinkered around with designer babies, Yankui he, and then there are great minds like such as George Church trying to kind of figure out. I mean, if we can bring back extinct species of animals with mammoth and stuff like that. So there's some exciting things which is happening. But like you said, I hope that we understand that we live in a beautiful planet, and we just got one Earth, and we need to kind of create technology which benefits everyone. We didn't touch the topic of therapeutics. You touched upon diagnostics. What is the potential of genome sequences when it kind of completely matures? Do you think we would actually live in a world where disease might get redundant, or is it just too far-fetched?
No, I don't think it is that far-fetched, right? I think, a large portion of the disease can be prevented even if they have a genetic mutation that sort of predisposes them, right? I think it is just our lifestyles that are, that need to change, right? So a large part can be done, and that's part of what we are doing right now. But there is also, I think, when you look at the world of therapeutics, I think, and there are certain things that are hard to prevent, right? Then, if you're looking at like a single gene disorder or something that is very difficult for someone to even do normal activities and all of that, I think gene therapies have been very, very helpful, right? So whether it is to understand some of the therapeutics that have been approved based on a specific function, or a CAR T therapy that is there for cancers and others. I think these are all precision-based medicines. They're still a little expensive for the average person to use, but compared to what was there earlier, I think we have the ability to be able to use that in patients. And I think for me, that itself is a great first start, because only when we have that will we come to a point where it becomes commonplace, right? It's the same thing when you go back 20 years and you look at genomics, I think from billions of dollars to a few, not even $100. So I think that itself is an exciting thing from the way I look at it. But from a therapeutics point of view, I think if you look at a large number of drugs that are being approved today, almost all of, like a large portion of them have a genetic marker or something that is there, right? So most of them are personalized in some form or the other. And not very long ago, I think this number wasn't that large. So now I think it's coming up to 30-40% or more. And in cancers, I think it's even higher. So I think that's what we are seeing is the value of coming to a point where you're able to understand what the DNA sequence is. The second is that if you look at the pandemic, I think if we did not have the genomic sequencing technologies, we would never have been able to control the pandemic the way we did today, right? I think the whole of vaccine development was done so quickly. The data was shared pretty much, within a matter of month, less than a month of the pandemic hitting us and so on. So I think that today we are in a very different age than where we were before. So if the same thing happened to us like 100 years ago, I think the damage would have been way higher now, given our population, but it did not. And I think that's the beauty of being able to have access to technologies like this, because it's not just doesn't just serve the purpose of what it was meant for the curiosity of that scientist or the set of scientists that created it, but the possibilities of applying it into many different directions is humongous. Many years ago, we would not have thought that maybe we can use this for athletes to sort of, improve their performance. We would not have thought about, can we eat better based on this? But we are finding all these interesting things because, we find out more and more about this every single day. So therapeutics, vaccines, drugs, everything now has a genomic component that is very much part and parcel of how you create a new drug or how do you come up with a new vaccine or otherwise. I don't think we heard about mRNA vaccines prior to the pandemic, but now everybody knows about mRNA
Exactly.
vaccine.
And I must add on to this. I think the reason we kind of figured out a vaccine so soon was because I think we broke away from a functioning silos, because so far, I mean, we function in silos, I mean, this was the first time everybody collaborated, and that was the output of coming discovering a vaccine so soon, such a short time. COVID, I mean, the vaccine, it's mutating. Have you been studying?
We have been, I mean, I think we can't, we have been, a lot of the data that we have goes to CCMB also for the sequencing piece. I think there are still some limitations around what private companies can do with the data. But I'm definitely studying it from as we see it mutating and what is happening with the virus. And luckily so far, I think I've so far been able to stay away from it. But it has been something that has pretty much caught. I think at least this Omicron variant has been quite widespread that is there. So yes, I have been studying it, and we will continue to study it because I think it's a fascinating case in terms of understanding not just what the virus does, but also how do our immune systems affect, how we respond to viruses. And we've been writing about that. We have hopefully publish something in that space because we did some research around that area. So I think it's 2-3 things on that front. One is, can we understand that certain populations are protected because of some of the variants? I mean, some of the genotypes that they have. Versus, can we understand? Has lifestyle played a role? So I think there are many fascinating things other than just the fact that how the virus itself has evolved, because that is intricately related to how our human race has evolved as well, right? Because virus by itself is nothing. It needs us to get to where it goes. So I think it is as important to study the human-virus interaction as it is to just look at it by itself.
Maybe paint a picture of how the world of healthcare is going to look like, in possibly the next 10 years.
So my hope is that, that everybody who's born will have a genomic profile as soon as they're born, right? I think just like we would do a simple blood test for a baby when they're born, I think one is if we had that information for everybody on the planet, I think that itself will help us understand humanity better. We'll understand why certain things have happened the way they have happened, and I think that's likely to happen because of how the price point awareness and accessibility has gone in. So one is that I definitely see that as being part of your medical records over a period of time. So that would be number one. The second is, I think from our own perspective, what we are doing at Mapmygenome is to integrate these different pieces of data together. We started as just one lab in Hyderabad, and we were doing genome patri, and then we added on some of the clinical NGS based tests and all of that for oncology and mother and child. We've now started adding on to biochemistry, and the reason for that was to be able to get it to a more precise understanding of how we can help somebody with that. So I think, and then maybe in the future there are other technologies, whether it is the microbiome and a few other pieces. So if you can integrate all of that together, I think there is, if you think about it from the future, you can say that your medicines that will be dispersed by the pharmacist will be based on that information that you have. The food that you eat will be based on some of the microbiome and your genetic data and also otherwise. So I think there are many possibilities on what can be if you are able to provide the genetic data to everybody, right? Because that will become maybe maybe it will get integrated with your phone data. So you scan something, it automatically picks that up and so on. So I think we are very quickly going to a point where all of this data will start converging, and we will be able to have access to information that we never had, but not in the form of information that today, for instance, I think people have to understand, what is relative risk. We need a genetic counselor to explain. But I think we'll get to a point where it becomes simple enough and regulated enough from a overall a commons perspective to be able to get to a point where it's simple enough for anybody to sort of not look at it from a report, but to be able to just talk to some IoT device and say, should I, is this something that is good for me or not good for me? It'll automatically tell you. So I think we are a few years away from that, but I think we are getting to that point where there will be a convergence of data. There will be simplicity in terms of, how we're going to present that data. And there's going to be an easy accessibility for people to be able to get that done in every single hospital that you're in the world.
Lovely. And thank you. I hope that dream comes true, because that would be a fantastic world, where it becomes simplified and the accessibility is there for everyone, So wish you and the team the very best. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. And until next time, see you guys. Bye. Thank you, Annie. Really appreciate this.
Thanks.